Today we're going to talk about EEG on stroke patients, presented by Shannon Haberman. The electroencephalogram, or EEG, is a diagnostic tool that is used to help diagnose epilepsy and brain death. In this case, we are going to be looking at stroke patients and using 256 electrodes arranged in a saline net as seen in the image. The results of EEG is an EEG reading of different waves, which are identified as alpha, beta, theta, and delta, and also seen in the image. In this paper, the researchers focused on beta because it is the normal waves in an awake adult, and delta because it is abnormal waves in an awake adult. The beta waves are characterized as high frequency and low amplitude, whereas the delta waves are characterized as low frequency and high amplitude. Before we start into my paper, I want to go over some definitions. The first definition is of a stroke. It is what you could call a brain attack, because it is when an area of the brain is cut off from the blood supply, which means that these cells are cut off from their supply of nutrients, and usually these cells result in cell death. In the brain, cell death can mean that the patient loses abilities like memory and muscle control depending on where the stroke occurs. A lesion is a region in an organ or tissue that has suffered damage due to injury or disease. Ipsilateral, as we had learned in class, means that there is the effect on the same side of the body. Contralateral means that the effect is on the opposite side of the body. The National Institute of Health Stroke Scale, or NIHSS, is a tool that healthcare providers use to quantify impairment caused by stroke. It is 11 items that scores the impairment from 0 to 4, with 4 being the greatest impairment. Partial least squares model, or PLS model, is computer software that is able to interpret the variance in the EEG recordings and quantify the data into a graph. The primary paper we're going to explore today is titled "The Utility of EEG Measures of the Brain Function in Patients with Acute Stroke" by Wu et al., published in the Journal of Neurophysiology in March of 2016. The hypotheses of the study are that the dense array EEG is going to be significantly quicker and more accurate than previous methods, and that the PLS models capture impairment better than the traditional quantitative measures. A quick explanation of the experiment setup is that there are 24 subjects that were admitted to the ER or the ICU due to an acute stroke. Each of these would be considered a case study because they were taken their demographics, given a consent form, and then quickly set up to have an EEG for 3 minutes, which was then processed by the PLS model and put into the experiment in order to analyze the outcomes. This is the delta wave data collected by the EEG and then processed by the PLS model. In part A, you see a person as if they are lying on their back with you at their head. The triangle on the top represents the person's nose, and the semicircles on each side represents the person's ears. If you look closely, you see smaller circles on part A that represent the electrodes of the EEG using a saline net. The black in this picture indicates the areas that have no impairments according to the methods. Then the variants of color show the variations of impairments in the different areas of the brain. Then, in part B, it shows the correlation between the EEG and the NIH stroke score on the ipsial lesional, or the lesions on the same side. Part C, contralesional, or lesions on the opposite side, is shown and indicates the correlation between the NIH stroke score and the EEG results. So both of these show a positive correlation between the EEG and the NIHSS with significant p-values, which means that the higher regions of the delta power correlated with higher levels of injury, However, the EEG results showed more specific results than the NIHSS. This figure is the same layout as the previous figure, but is for the beta waves. So you can see that there are lesions or color changes in part D. Then you still see the correlation on the ipsilesional in part E and on the contralesional in part F between the NIHSS and the EEG. However, this shows it is a negative correlation because higher levels of beta power correlates to low levels of injury. This makes sense because beta waves are typically produced when an adult is awake, so having these produced would indicate non-injury. This is opposite from the last one because it was positive correlation, because delta waves are not typically produced when an adult is awake, so having those produced when they are awake would indicate injury. The conclusions from the study are that advances in the EEG using PLS modeling had a strong correlation to previous measures such as NIHSS. EEG captures significant information in order to assess the ability and injury of the stroke patients. EEG is easily accessible and superior due to the use of the 256 electrode in a saline net. It made it very easy for the patients to be tested quickly, whether it was in a ER or a ICU setting. And it also concluded that the neuronal function and the neuronal injury relate to impairment because it was able to assess the function of the electrical signals through the EEG and then neuronal injury through the mapping in the PLS modeling and relate it to the impairment due to the stroke. Future research could be using EEGs to find biomarkers, or using EEGs to find another rapid, non-invasive method for measuring brain function that could be more widely used rather than depending on expensive equipment like EEGs and PLS models. My discussion questions are: how does this current study help the patients that are affected with stroke, or how could it potentially help those patients? My second one is, although the current methods proved to have been better results and were more rapid and non-invasive than previous methods, the article explains that the hardware and software are probably not a widespread solution. Using the information of the current study, what could be a technique they could adopt in order to keep the quickness, non-invasiveness, and add the ability for it to be widespread? Why, and what are limitations or different additional information they would need?